In the last cold weeks of 1887, Hester Voss stood on the muddy edge of Rookwater Creek with a spade in her hands. She was 24, widowed young, and alone on land most men said the water would take. She did not cry. She did not explain. She drove the spade into the bank, opened a narrow slit, and pressed a bare willow cutting deep into the wet soil. Then another. Then another. Behind her, Juniper, an old dun-gray mare, waited with a drag of willow bundles and cottonwood stakes. Beside the water, Bracken, Hester's dog, moved with sharp, clever eyes, stopping now and then to watch the creek slide past in silence. A wagon slowed on the road above. Amos Bellwether, a neighboring farmer, leaned from the wagon seat and laughed. "Looks like she's planting shade for the minnows." Hester heard him. The creek kept moving, brown and quiet. She set her boot against the mud and tamped the willow tighter. To understand what brought her to this muddy bank, one had to look back. 2 years earlier, Hester Voss had buried her husband. Caleb Rusk had been only 26 when a timber wagon overturned on a rain-soaked grade. By sunset, the horses had been caught. The logs had been cleared. Caleb never came home. Hester was 22. She stayed through one hard winter, then packed what little remained and returned to Marrowbend Valley in the Missouri Ozarks. Waiting there was the only inheritance her grandfather, Silas Voss, had left behind. People called it Voss Bottom. They also called it bottomland with a hungry edge. The soil could grow almost anything. The creek could steal it a little at a time. Every spring, Rookwater Creek bit another piece from the bank, as though the farm had been measured with a dull knife. Inside the weathered farmhouse, Caleb's old work coat still hung behind the door. Hester never moved it. The land was all she had left, carrying the Voss name. If the creek claimed it, nothing else would remain. Each evening, the farmhouse was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the oil lamp. Bracken curled beneath the kitchen table, while Hester opened the worn leather notebook her grandfather had carried for decades. The pages smelled of leather, wood smoke, and damp earth. They held rough sketches of timber bridges, hand-cut drainage ditches, bank stakes, and one drawing covered with branching lines that looked almost like veins. Willow roots. Across the top of the page, Silas had written one sentence. "A creek will not obey stone for long. Give it roots, and it may bargain." As a little girl, Hester had followed him along this same creek. He had never lectured. He simply pointed. Watch where the water touches first. Watch where the mud cracks. Watch which way the grass bends after a hard rain. The creek never strikes everywhere, he had once told her. It always looks for the weakest place. Silas was gone, but his notebook remained. So did her eyes. So did the creek, quietly carrying away another piece of Voss Bottom every year. Armed with a solution, Hester set to work. By the time Hester reached Maeve Kittredge's general store, half the valley had already decided what she ought to do. Sell Voss Bottom before the creek finishes the job. Tilda Bellwether, Amos's wife, sighed. She's young enough to marry again. No sense spending a life fighting mud and water. Hester gathered nails, fence wire, salt, and a new spade without looking up. Maeve glanced at the pile. Fixing the pasture fence? Hester shook her head. The creek bank. The store fell quiet for a heartbeat. Then someone chuckled. Her silence sounded more stubborn than any argument she could have made. Ignoring the whispers, Hester began her work at the weakest bend along Rookwater Creek, a stretch that measured only 43 feet. It was here that every season the current carved another bite from the bank, leaving fresh scars of raw earth behind. Hester worked from one end to the other with quiet precision. Each willow cutting went 14 to 17 inches into the damp soil. Each one leaned upstream at roughly 35 degrees. She left 18 to 24 inches between them, enough room for roots to spread, but close enough to weave together beneath the surface. From a distance, none of that could be seen. People saw only a young widow pushing bare sticks into the mud. Juniper waited patiently beside the bank, the old mare still harnessed to a small drag loaded with fresh willow whips and cottonwood stakes. Bracken padded along the water's edge, his shaggy brown coat catching bits of burr and dried grass. Every few moments he stopped, studying the current as if it deserved watching. It was then that Amos Bellwether rested both arms across his fence rail. Still planting shade for the minnows, he called to Tilda. She laughed with him. Then she looked back at Hester a little longer. Not with understanding, with the uneasy look people wear when they cannot decide whether someone is stubborn or seeing something they have completely missed. They didn't understand because they didn't know what her grandfather had left behind. Silas had never believed a creek could be beaten by force. He believed it could be understood. Water rarely destroyed a bank by simply flowing past it. It undercut the base first. Once the lower edge disappeared, the weight above lost its support. Then the whole wall of earth collapsed under its own weight. Many farmers fought that force with heavy stone. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the rocks only pushed the current faster, creating a deeper whirl that carved an even larger wound downstream. Dead logs could slow the water for a season or two. Then they rotted. Willows worked differently. Planted in the right season and driven deep enough into moist ground, the living stems produced dense, fibrous roots. Those roots spread through the soil like a woven net. Flexible branches bent with the current instead of snapping against it. Low brush caught drifting silt, allowing the bank to rebuild itself one flood at a time instead of washing away. That was the difference. Hester was not planting trees. She was building a living willow revetment. Cottonwood stakes would steady the weakest bends. Small river stones would protect the toe of the bank without forcing the current into a hard turn. Clay and rotted straw would hold moisture around the cuttings. Behind the bank, a shallow drainage trench would release trapped rainwater before it could weaken the soil from above. The creek could never be ordered where to go, but perhaps it could be given fewer places to win. A few days later, Orrin Pike, the valley's fence builder and carpenter, stopped beside the creek without saying a word. He watched Hester drive another willow cutting into the bank. Finally, he shook his head. "Water doesn't care what's still alive," he said. "It only cares what it can tear loose." He pointed toward the bend. "If that were my ground, I'd drive oak posts twice as deep and haul down wagon loads of stone. Or I'd give up this corner before the creek takes it anyway." Hester rested both hands on the handle of her spade. What if the stone pushes the current into someone else's bank? Orrin hesitated. For a moment, he studied the bend instead of her. Then he shrugged. Stone is still stone. Sticks are only sticks. Bracken stood quietly between them, never taking his eyes off the moving water. Hester said nothing. She measured another 18 inches with the blade of her spade, pressed the next willow whip deeper into the damp earth, and packed the mud firmly around it. Arguments could wait. Roots could not. Word eventually reached Wade Harrow, the county road supervisor responsible for drainage ditches and roadbeds throughout Marrow Bend Valley. He rode out to see the work himself. "I've been told you're changing the creek," he said. "If this bank throws the current toward the county road or into somebody else's pasture, we'll all pay for it." Those words settled heavier than Amos's laughter or Orrin's advice. Hester had never feared being called foolish. She feared being wrong. Without a word, she led Wade along the bank. Cedar stakes marked the ground at regular intervals. Each carried knife cuts showing dry season water, old bank lines, and every place the creek had bitten into the soil after a hard rain. A 50-foot hemp measuring line lay neatly coiled on the grass. "I track the changes every month," she said quietly. Wade examined the marks on the cedar posts one by one. Every measurement was precise. He gave a slow nod. No praise. No approval. Only 4 calm words. Then keep measuring. Hester watched him ride away. For the first time, the work felt larger than her own land. If the creek judged her wrong, someone else might pay the price. The work grew one measured section at a time. The first 43 feet became 60. 60 became 100. Before winter settled across Marrow Bend Valley, Hester had marked out the entire 214 feet of vulnerable bank that Silas had once circled in his notebook. Nothing about the work was hurried. Every few mornings, Juniper pulled a small drag down to an old slough below the bend, where black willow and sandbar willow grew thick along the water's edge. Hester cut living shoots as long as her arm, trimmed away weak branches, and bundled them with hemp twine before loading them onto the drag. Bracken always ran ahead, The dog stopped wherever the ground felt hollow beneath his paws, sniffing the damp earth before looking back at Hester. More than her boundary. 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 His hesitation drew her attention to soft spots where the bank had already begun separating beneath the grass. Those places received extra care. Along the sharpest curve, she drove cottonwood stakes every 5 feet with a wooden maul until each post bit firmly into the soil. Between them, she planted willow whips closer together than before, knowing the roots would someday weave beneath the surface instead of competing with one another. Near the toe of the bank, she bent young willow rods sideways and wove them into a low living barrier. It stood only knee-high, but it was never meant to stop the creek. Its purpose was to slow the water just enough for silt to settle. Above the woven brush, she packed damp clay around every cutting, mixing it with rotted straw so the soil would stay moist through dry spells. At the very bottom of the slope, she scattered only fist-sized river stones, never large boulders. Large stone forced water to fight. Small stone helped the bank breathe. Behind the revetment, she dug a shallow drainage trench, no deeper than 9 inches, carrying rainwater away, before it could soak the ground behind the bank and weaken it from above. By late afternoon, her hands were cracked from cold mud and rough bark. Several times each day, one glove slipped into the wet clay. Before she even noticed, Bracken would trot over, lift it gently between his teeth, and carry it back with the quiet pride of a dog who believed every task mattered. Lunch was usually nothing more than cold cornbread eaten on a stump overlooking the creek. Juniper rested nearby, steam drifting from her coat. The creek flowed past without a word. No neighbors stopped to help. No one praised the work. Most still believed they were watching a lonely widow bury sticks in the mud. Only Hester understood that she was not planting trees. She was building a living bank that would have only one chance to prove itself when the water finally came. Winter did not test the entire bank. It tested only the places where Hester had been careless. A late-season rain pushed Rookwater Creek just high enough to tug at the youngest plantings. By the following morning, 23 willow whips leaned downstream, and 9 had disappeared completely, pulled from the loosened soil before they had rooted. Bracken found several of them tangled in dead grass farther along the bank. Hester gathered each one without a word. As she knelt beside the empty holes, Amos Bellwether slowed his wagon again. "Still trying to stitch water with twigs?" he called. This time, Hester did not ignore the remark. She looked at the exposed bank. She looked at the missing cuttings. Instead of defending herself, she simply acknowledged the flaw, too shallow near the outer bend. There was no excuse, only an observation. That afternoon, she drove every replacement cutting deeper into the bank, increasing the angle against the current. Along the exposed edge, she wove fresh willow rods into a tighter, lower brush line to soften the pull of moving water before it reached the young stems. The creek had exposed a mistake, not a failure, a lesson. Hester accepted it the same way she accepted rain, frost, or hunger, by measuring it, then changing the work. Ice settled across the young willow stems, turning each branch white before sunrise. The creek looked asleep. It wasn't. One bitter night, Bracken let out a single sharp bark, then another. Instead of waiting at the porch, the dog grabbed the cuff of Hester's coat and pulled toward the darkness. She caught the lantern, slipped on her boots, and followed him through the frozen pasture. The problem was not the creek, it was the fence. A broken rail had left an opening wide enough for the Bellwethers' cattle. By the time Hester reached the bank, several animals had wandered onto the soft ground, crushing 17 young willow cuttings beneath their hooves. She never shouted. She eased the cattle back through the gap, tied the fence together with spare wire, then knelt in the freezing mud, lifting each bent stem as gently as if it were still alive. Juniper hauled fresh fence posts before dawn. By morning, the damage had been repaired as well as it could be. Tilda Bellwether walked over carrying an uneasy apology. "I'm sorry. They found the opening before we did." Amos only shrugged. "Cows don't know where property lines are." Hester pressed another willow into place and looked toward the creek. "No," she said quietly. "Water doesn't read boundary lines either." No one answered. Only Bracken remained beside her, watching the current as though he already knew it would return one day to ask a much harder question. By early spring of 1888, Hester made the only mistake she would later call avoidable. She feared the creek would cut beneath the bank before the willow roots had time to knit the soil together. So she added more stone. For one short section, she stacked larger rocks along the toe of the slope, believing extra weight would buy the young cuttings another season. The next high water proved otherwise. The stones did not move. The current did. Forced away from the rock, the water curled into a tighter whirlpool just downstream. When the creek dropped back into its channel, Hester found a fresh pocket carved beneath the bank beyond the stones. The protection had simply pushed the problem somewhere else. Orrin Pike stopped by that afternoon. He looked from the exposed soil to the scattered rocks and gave a knowing smile. "If stone couldn't hold it," he said, "those willow sticks surely won't." Hester barely heard him. She was watching the water. The stones had not failed because they were weak. They had failed because they had tried to stop the creek instead of guiding it. That evening, she pulled out every oversized rock she had placed. Only smaller river stones remained to protect the toe of the bank without forcing the current into a hard turn. She wove another layer of living willow brush across the exposed edge, creating a softer barrier that encouraged the water to slow instead of collide. That evening, a new realization settled in her mind. Do not fight the whole creek. Slow the edge. It was no longer just her grandfather's wisdom. It had become her own. By the summer of 1888, the creek bank no longer looked abandoned. It looked unfinished. The willows had begun to leaf out in uneven patches. Some stood straight and healthy. Others were little more than thin green switches, with a handful of narrow leaves trembling above the water. A few cuttings Hester had nearly given up on surprised her with fresh shoots, pushing through weathered bark. Life was returning, quietly. She kept measuring instead of celebrating. The first section held a survival rate of roughly 2/3. The later sections, planted after she corrected her early mistakes, performed noticeably better. Wherever the soil stayed cool and damp beneath the brush, roots spread quickly. Where the afternoon sun baked the exposed bank, losses remained higher. The notebook grew thicker with numbers instead of opinions. One afternoon, Wade Harrow stopped while inspecting the county road above the valley. He walked to the cedar stakes, lining the bank, and noticed fresh knife marks carved into nearly every one. Water levels, bank movement, monthly measurements. He compared several marks to the figures Hester had meticulously tracked. Everything matched. He gave a slow nod. There was still no compliment. But this time, he also offered no warning to stop. That quiet change meant more than approval. Back at Maeve Kittredge's store, people still smiled whenever someone mentioned the widow's brush fence. The nickname had survived. The laughter had not. Instead, new questions drifted through the room. Are those willows actually taking hold? Do living roots really spread that fast? No one knew the answer yet. The green line along Rookwater Creek was still young. Most of its work remained hidden beneath the soil, where no eye could judge it. The roots were growing. Whether they had grown enough was a question only the next great flood would be able to answer. Late one evening, Hester returned from the creek with damp. She hung her wet coat beside Caleb's old work jacket. It still rested on the same peg behind the door. She never found another place for it. Outside, Juniper shifted quietly in the barn. Beneath the kitchen table, Bracken settled at Hester's feet. The lamp burned quietly. Looking out the window into the darkness, Hester remembered a single sentence her grandfather had once told her. The bank fails long before it falls. Beyond the glass, Rookwater Creek flowed unseen. She listened to the sound of the water for a long moment. Nothing else needed to be said. April of 1889 arrived one gray morning at a time. There was no violent storm. Not yet. Instead, rain settled over Marrowbin Valley and refused to leave. One day became 3. 3 became 5. By the 9th day, the ground no longer absorbed water. Every footstep released a dull, heavy sound beneath the grass. The shallow drainage trench behind Hester's revetment stayed full. The cedar stakes carried a new watermark every morning. Birds abandoned the lower brush and built higher along the ridge. Bracken noticed before Hester did The dog no longer wandered close to the creek. Whenever they walked the bank, he kept drifting uphill, glancing back toward the water with quiet unease. Hester measured every rise against the knife marks carved into the cedar posts. Each mark erased another bit of certainty. On the 9th night, the rain changed. It struck the roof, in hard bursts, sharp as handfuls of gravel. There was no one else to decide what should be done. She led Juniper into the highest stall of the barn, fastened an extra length of rope across the door, checked the feed one last time, then lifted her lantern. Bracken was already waiting at the gate. Together they walked toward Rookwater Creek. The water no longer sounded familiar. It carried a deeper voice. Standing at the weakest bend, Hester rested one hand against the trunk of the oldest willow. Beneath the mud, unseen roots had spent 19 months searching through the soil, tying themselves into the earth exactly as Silas had believed they would. She had measured, she had corrected mistakes, she had rebuilt what failed. Nothing more could be done. Whether 19 months had been enough, only the creek could answer that. The answer came before dawn. Rookwater Creek climbed over its banks without warning. By midnight, the water stood 4 feet and 7 inches above its ordinary mark. It was no longer a creek. It was a moving wall of cold, brown force carrying branches, broken fence rails, uprooted brush, and heavy sheets of mud. Bracken barked once, then again. Louder this time. The water had reached the drainage trench. Hester caught the dog's collar before he stepped too close, then moved with him onto slightly higher ground. Rain stung her face. The lantern flame fought the wind. She could barely see through the darkness. But she could hear everything. Wood striking wood. Stones rolling beneath the current. The deep grinding sound of earth giving way somewhere downstream. Then it came. A long crack. Across the valley, Eli Stroud, a neighboring hay farmer downstream, watched part of his creek bank collapse into the flood. The current swallowed an entire section of pasture in seconds. Fence posts tipped, vanished, and drifted away with tangled wire trailing behind them. Farther upstream, muddy water poured into the bellwether's grazing field. Amos stood in the rain, holding a lantern that seemed far too small against the storm. He did not laugh. He did not speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the creek. At the lower end of Voss Bottom, where Hester had not yet finished extending the work, the bank failed exactly as Silas had warned. A wide slab of earth broke loose and disappeared into the darkness. Then the flood reached the 214 feet of living revetment. Nothing stood rigid. The willow stems bent until their leaves lay flat against the racing water. Cottonwood stakes leaned under the pressure. Clay washed away from the surface. Brush fences disappeared beneath the flood. For one long moment, it looked as though everything would be torn free. It wasn't. The current pulled. The roots answered. Hidden beneath the mud, 19 months of living fibers held the bank together. Instead of breaking apart, the earth flexed. Water rushed over it, around it, through it, but it did not carry it away. The creek had made its judgment. Not with words, with force. Morning arrived without triumph. The rain eased into a thin gray mist, and one by one the people of Marrowbend Valley stepped outside to survey the aftermath. The destruction was undeniable, but there was little left to say. By mid-morning, Wade Harrow arrived carrying a survey chain and measuring rod. Without hurry, he began recording the cold reality of what the creek had claimed. Eli Stroud had lost 82 feet of good pasture. The bellwether's grazing field had been carved back by more than 20 feet, their fence posts now dangling over the muddy water. Near the county road, part of the shoulder had slumped toward the water, leaving a jagged scar. At the unfinished lower end of Voss Bottom, 6 feet of earth had been cut away. Then Wade walked to the protected section. The willow revetment looked battered. Branches were broken. Mud coated the woven brush. Several cottonwood stakes leaned at awkward angles. Nothing about it looked impressive. But the measurements told another story. The main channel had not shifted. The protected bank still held. Nearly 2 acres of bottom soil remained, where the current had tried hardest to claim it. Wade wrote every number into his field book without adding a single opinion. Beside him, Orrin Pike studied the scarred willows for a long time. He searched for loose stones, for broken roots, for some hidden trick he might have missed. He found none. Only living stems still anchored in living ground. No one celebrated. Eli had lost good land. The bellwethers had lost pasture. The flood had spared no family completely. Yet standing beside the quiet line of battered willows, everyone could see what the creek itself had already decided. The bank had not survived because it was stronger than the water. It had survived because it had learned how to bend without letting go. 3 days after the flood, Amos Bellwether walked into Voss Bottom alone. Mud still clung to his boots from the pasture the creek had torn apart. He stopped a few feet from Hester. There was no joke, no mention of planting shade for the minnows. He cleared his throat. "You got any willow cuttings left?" Hester studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. Without another word, she led him behind the barn, where bundles of fresh willow cuttings rested in a long watering trough beneath damp burlap. Bracken walked beside her, his tail moving slowly. This time, he never barked. Hester picked up one cutting. "About as thick as your thumb," she said. "Cut the bottom at an angle. Plant it deep enough to reach wet ground. Lean it upstream." She handed Amos a scrap of paper with the spacing, depth, and angle written in careful pencil. He read it twice, then folded the paper into a neat square and slipped it into the breast pocket of his work shirt. Neither of them spoke about the flood. Neither spoke about the laughter. The request itself had already said everything that needed saying. The following season, a thin line of young willows appeared along the edge of the bellwether's pasture. Soon afterward, Eli Stroud repaired his fences and came to Voss Bottom asking for cuttings of his own. Hester spent an afternoon helping him plant the first row. She never reminded him that he had once doubted the idea. There was no reason to. Even Orrin Pike began changing the way he protected weak creek banks. Fewer heavy stones appeared in his work. More woven willow brush lined the water's edge. When Wade Harrow completed his annual county report, one short entry found its way into the record. Living willow work held along Voss Bottom. Nothing more. At Maeve Kittredge's general store, no sign announced a new method. Instead, several bundles of fresh willow cuttings quietly appeared in a water trough behind the building for anyone who asked. That was how useful knowledge traveled across the frontier. Not through speeches, not through pride. One neighbor learned, then another. Soon the creek banks themselves began telling the story better than any person could. Years passed, and the willows along Voss Bottom rose well above a man's height. Each season pushed their roots deeper into the earth. Some of the old cottonwood stakes had long since rotted away beneath the soil. They no longer mattered. The living roots had taken over the work. Hester remained on the same farm. Juniper's pace grew slower with age, but the old mare still followed familiar paths across the pasture. Bracken's muzzle turned silver, yet every morning the dog walked beside Hester along the creek, pausing at the same bends he had watched since he was young. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb's work coat still hung behind the door. It had become part of the house instead of a wound that refused to heal. Silas Voss's leather notebook rested on the same kitchen table, but its final pages were no longer written in his hand. They belonged to Hester now. Season after season, she filled them with measurements, sketches, small corrections, and observations gathered from storms that never appeared exactly alike. Nothing in those pages claimed victory over nature. Because nature had never been defeated, Rookwater Creek still flooded. It still shifted gravel bars. It still searched patiently for weak ground. The valley simply understood it better than before. Across Marrowbend, more creek banks slowly turned green with living willow. The method spread quietly because it worked, not because anyone tried to make a legend out of it. That was how the frontier remembered useful ideas, not by the names attached to them, by the lives and land they continued to protect. The creek never cared who had laughed. It never cared who had doubted. It never cared who had finally believed. It remembered only the shape of the land, the force of the current, the weakness of exposed soil, and the strength hidden beneath it. A creek does not remember laughter. It remembers roots,